Sarah's going to read to us from the beginning of Matthew chapter 23.
I'm reading from chapter 23, verses 1 to 12. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they preach. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on the shoulders of others, but they themselves are unwilling to lift a finger to move them. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make phylacteries broad and their fringes long. They love to have the place of honour at banquets, the best seats in the synagogues, and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces, and to have people call them Rabbi. But you are not called Rabbi, for you have one teacher called Rabbi, and you are all brothers and sisters. And call no one to your Father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Nor are you called to be instructors, for you have one instructor, the Messiah. The greatest among you will be your servant. All those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted."
Brilliant. Thank you ever so much, Sarah. And good morning, everyone. It's great to see you. If you missed the introductions, I'm Andy. I'm one of the ministers here. And we are continuing our journey through Matthew's Gospel. And we're looking briefly at the whole of Matthew 23, but mainly at that first bit that we've just heard read. We're moving closer and closer to the climax of Matthew's Gospel. We'll get there at Easter. But at the moment, two kingdoms are on a collision course, and the tension is slowly being ramped up. On the one side is Jesus, this itinerant preacher and healer, an apparent miracle worker, accompanied by his oddball collection of followers. His followers are still today a fairly oddball collection, aren't they? Aren't we? On the other side is the might of the Jewish religious machine, with the power of the Roman Empire lurking behind in the background. The stakes are high, and the rhetoric is getting more and more juicy as the lines are drawn. And so Jesus says to the crowds and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees, the religious machine, sit on Moses' seat. Therefore do whatever they teach you and follow it, but do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach. Maybe we just need to note at the beginning that Jesus is not actually addressing the Pharisees, the scribes at the moment. He's warning his followers. He's saying, don't be like them. Because that desire that they have for status, for power, for influence can destroy you and cause you to oppress others. Interesting, Jesus doesn't seem to have a problem with their teaching. He says, do what they do what they say. He doesn't have a problem with their theology or whatever it is. His problem is that they don't live it out. They don't practice what they preach. Which means that today's sermon is mainly addressed to me. And you can listen in if you'd like to. One gets very nervous when you have to preach on a line like that. But in the verses that follow, Jesus kind of spells out what he is referring to, what he means, and what is the problem with the religious guys. Firstly, they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear. They lay heavy burdens on other people. I guess we're all familiar with the Ten Commandments, the law that God gave to Moses to guide Israel on how they were to live as God's people, how they were to live in response to the God who had saved them and delivered them. But when you read the books of, Exodus through to Deuteronomy, 4 of the first 5 books of the Bible, you'll notice that there is a whole load of regulations that are kind of wrapped around the law. The aim, if you like, was to help Israel to live out the law in the various circumstances of life, to cover the inevitable what-if questions. Well, if this happens, what do we do? How do we put this into practice? But of course, even this expanded list did not cover every eventuality. And so the Mishnah was born. The Mishnah was a Jewish teaching that wrapped, eventually, I think, another 1,500 commands to the list. The aim was laudable, to spell out in every situation what was the right thing to do. The reality was a legalistic headache that not even the Pharisees, with all their learning, could add to. Serving and obeying God was meant to be a joy and an act of love, not a legalistic nightmare, not an exercise in reading the small print. It had become a burden that was hard to bear. I wonder if we ever lay heavy burdens on ourselves or on others, unrealistic expectations on other people. The church has history here. Some of you may have grown up in churches where the expectation was that if you didn't go to church twice or even 3 times on a Sunday, or have a daily quiet time, or tithe, somehow you were a second-class Christian. You were not quite up to it because you didn't do all the things you were meant to do. Personally, I've lost count of the number of pastoral conversations I've had with folks who've kind of internalized that message that I'm not a good enough Christian because I failed to meet some arbitrary standard that some church leader has told me I need to do. Anyone here ever feel like a second-class Christian? Somehow I'm not quite good enough. I can see numbers of people nodding. And sadly, churches can be some of the most judgmental places around, can't they? I know some of you have experienced that. But there is no hierarchy to holiness. No hierarchy to holiness. Our holiness depends on what God does, not on how successful we are being at being a good Christian in inverted commas. Jesus' burden is light, and his yoke is easy. So let's not place lots of burdens on other people. Secondly, the Pharisees were driven by self-promotion. They do all their deeds to be seen by others, Jesus says in verse 5. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes or tassels long. How's your phylactery? They're small leather boxes that in them they had the words of the Shema, which I guess was the kind of Jewish equivalent to the Lord's Prayer. It was a prayer that the faithful Jew would say often numbers of times a day, particularly before they went to bed. So it's this reminder to pray, if you like. And the fringes were simply tassels, which were attached to one's garments as a visual cue to remind you to pray. So when life was tough or you were struggling, you had something you could hold on to, and then you'd be drawn into prayer. And Jesus is not against those things. Many scholars think Jesus probably wore tassels himself. The problem is that instead of reminding you to pray, the tassels became a kind of, look at me, I pray. Rather than encouraging you to be a prayerful person, it became a, look at me, I'm so holy. Are we motivated by self-promotion? Of course we are. We all want people to like us, don't we? We want people to have a good opinion of us. We might say that we don't care what other people think of us. But most of us would be lying if we said that, wouldn't we? Yeah, I would. We might not wear, I wish I could say phylacteries or tassels, but we have our carefully curated Facebook page or our Instagram stream or our LinkedIn profile. We Photoshop our selfies. We're not immune from the occasional bit of virtue signaling. We've become this kind of look at me hashtag. I was going to say, does anyone remember Keeping Up Appearances? But your reaction, you do. It's for those of you who don't know, it was a 90s sitcom starring Patricia Routledge, who played Hyacinth Bouquet. Bouquet is spelt B-U-C-K-E-T. Who would answer the phone with the words, "The Bouquet residence, the lady of the house speaking." Of course, she was a social climbing snob whose hapless attempts to appear important by lording it over her neighbours were generally undone by her long-standing husband and the rest of the family. Like the best comedy, Keeping Up Appearances invites us to look at ourselves, to maybe recognise some of our own characteristics in Hyacinth. She exaggerated them completely, but to see something, to recognise ourselves in what we laugh at, to see our own preposterous attempts sometimes to appear important. Image, self-promotion. And finally, they loved to have the place of honour at banquets. They wanted the best, they wanted status, they wanted the best seats in the house. They had an inflated sense of their own importance. They craved respect and power. Some kind of first century equivalent of influencers today. One scholar said they wanted all the fame a small community could offer, to be big fish in a small pond. In the Roman world, whenever you walked into a room with lots of people in, you would scan the space and immediately rank everyone in the room in terms of importance. Then you would talk to the most important people and try and get into their good graces, especially the people you consider to be more powerful. That's basically how it worked in Paul's world. None of us would ever do that, would we? Who are the important people? Oh, and they love their titles too. But you are not to be called rabbi, Jesus said, because they like to call themselves rabbi. For you have one teacher, and you're all brothers and sisters. And call no one your father on earth, for you have one Father, the one in heaven. Have you noticed that Jesus doesn't have a lot of time for status or for the hierarchies they represent? He knows how destructive they can be. We're not meant to be into titles or hierarchies either. Churches love titles. Father, pastor, not to mention reverend. I'm a pastor, that's what I do. But please don't use that as a job title. Just call me Andy. And don't call me reverend either. Reverend means one to be revered, worthy of respect. Might just go to my head. There is only one teacher and one Father. And there is only one who is to be revered. And each one of us sits at his feet as equals. as family. There is no pecking order in the church. No pecking order. Instead, Jesus says, the greatest among you will be your servant, and all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. It's possibly one of the most countercultural statements in the whole of the Bible. Certainly was in first century Rome, and it still is today, I think. We've built a whole culture around the cult of celebrity, around that desire for power. And Jesus turns the whole thing upside down in one simple two sentences, allied with a life of service and a death on the cross. The direction of travel of the church is always to be downwards rather than upwards, whatever that looks like. I'm going to come back to that in a moment, but I said we were going to cover the whole of Matthew 23, or the rest of it. I want to briefly do that, because really the rest of the chapter is a tale of woe. It's woeful. There are 7 woes. It's a kind of contrast to the Beatitudes in Matthew 5 that I think we started our service with the Beatitudes, didn't we? The Beatitudes right at the beginning of Jesus' ministry, the woes, as it were, right towards the end of Jesus' ministry. There are 7 woes and 8 blessings. And this time Jesus is directly speaking to the Pharisees. And he doesn't mince his words. There are these woes, and we're going to look at one of them briefly. But he calls them hypocrites 6 times in a few verses. He calls them blind fools or blind guides. A brood of vipers is another term he uses. And this in verse 27 and 28. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites. There we go. You are like whitewashed tombs, which look beautiful on the outside, but on the inside are full of the bones of the dead and everything unclean. In the same way, on the outside, you appear to people as righteous, but on the inside, you are full of hypocrisy and wickedness. No wonder they wanted to get rid of him, is it? It's not how you speak to your religious leaders, to anyone in power, is it? You're going to upset people. The religious leaders claim to be about the flourishing of the community, about the common good, but really they're just interested in number one. They're like whitewashed tombs. On the outside, they looked clean and pure. But on the inside, they were full of decay and reeked of death. In the Old Testament, woes, I don't know what you hear when you hear that word woe, but in the Old Testament, woes were used to describe that those who had set themselves against God and against his purposes. So Jesus is kind of telling the religious leaders, you're not on God's side. The woes aren't a warning of punishment as such. I think it's a bit like this. If you allow yourself to behave selfishly, then selfishness becomes embedded in your personality. If you repeatedly act selfishly, then you become selfish and self-obsessed and increasingly incapable of grace and mercy and so on, because selfishness has inhabited you, let's say. You've chosen that way. You become dehumanized and closed to God, a bit like a whitewashed tomb. It's not so much if you're selfish, God will punish you. The punishment is in that movement towards selfishness, towards the ways of death. And conversely, if you practice mercy, say, then becoming mercy over time, becoming merciful becomes embedded in your character over time. If you do something enough, then you become like it, don't you? Mercy becomes a habit, then it becomes embedded in your character. And that's the blessing. It's not a case of if I do something good, God is going to reward me and bless me. The blessing is in the doing good. It is in the becoming more like Jesus, becoming rehumanized, as it were. That's the blessing. That's where life is to be found. Does that make sense? Yeah, it's a different way of thinking often, but the blessing is in what we become as we live these things out. And we can see that in the words around our room. But the Pharisees, the religious folks, have chosen a different path. A path that ultimately leads to death. And so Jesus returns. The greatest among you will be your servant. All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who humble themselves will be exalted. Maybe the central verse. I think it is the central verse of the whole chapter. What is humility, I wonder? What does it mean to be humble? I think often we tend to think of humility as an attitude or a mindset. The dictionary says this. It says, humility is having a modest or low view of one's importance. I guess that's the way we normally use it. It's that sense of, having a low opinion of oneself almost. But I'm not actually sure that's what Jesus means. I love this quote I found. Whoops, there we go. A guy called Dennis Edwards, who's written a book trying to explore how humility is taught in the Bible, as it were. He says, I have come to define humility as a posture of submission to God that works itself out in acts of peacemaking, including dismantling injustice and contributing to the flourishing of all creation. Humility is a posture. It's not just a mindset. Humility can mean I'm aware that I'm good at things. I'm aware that I have strengths. I'm aware of my qualities. But I'm going to use those to build others up, rather to inflate my own sense of importance. I'm going to use those to build others up. I'm going to lift others up rather than myself. That's the mistake of the Pharisees. It was about them. It's not about saying I'm useless. I can't do that, or I can't do this. I'm rubbish. Jesus was humble. He delighted in lifting up and giving honor to those whom culture ignored or disrespected. And if we had a bit more time, maybe we could explore who in our culture is ignored or disrespected and how we might honor them. Maybe that's a bit of homework for you. Who is in our society that is ignored, disrespected, pushed down? And how might we, you, I, honor them? But as we finish, I just want to think of 4 or 5 practices that we can do that lift other people up. practice of listening, especially to those who have no voice. Somebody said it's the greatest gift you can give to somebody is to simply listen to them, to allow them to voice who they are, what they're struggling with, what are their hopes and what are their fears. To say those things out loud and to be heard. It's amazing how often people say, I just want to be heard. The practice of listening. And of course, when we listen to someone, when we really listen to them, when we hear their hopes and their pains and their fears and their joys, when we hear their story of who they are and how they got to where they are, then we find our hearts being changed. We find our hearts being drawn towards them. We find ourselves wanting to be with them, to enter their story. I was struck by your prayers, Lyle. You talked about God sitting with a whole group of people who are struggling. That's what we do when we listen. We sit with folks. And if we are to live well together, then we need to learn to listen to each other, to see and to hear each other's struggles. Practice of listening. The practice of compassion. Life is hard, isn't it? It's full of demands. It can be full of suffering sometimes. And we're often tired and not at our best. And life comes together and then it falls apart. And then it comes together again and then it all goes pear-shaped again. And people let us down and we let other people down. And we let ourselves down. And a community without compassion will either degenerate into moralizing or it will fall apart. I've got a little postcard on my wall which says, I try to take one day at a time, but sometimes 3 days hit me simultaneously. Ever feel like that? And then we don't always act out our best person. Be gentle with each other. Be compassionate with each other. And be gentle with yourselves as well. Be gentle with yourselves. The practice of speaking positively. Our society is so quick to put other people down, aren't they? To criticize. Faults, mistakes are picked up on and magnified. We're quick to criticize and slow to praise. How about reversing that? Get into the practice of recognizing the good in other people. Maybe particularly in people you struggle with. Let's face it, there are people that we all struggle with. Seeing the good and speaking positively to them. Fourthly, the practice of service. I'm not going to say much about this, but John Mark Comer, I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Is that the way it says that service is the ultimate expression of love because it is self-giving without getting anything in return. Doing things because it is the right thing to do. And finally, shush. The practice of secrecy. Just doing something good for someone. It can be major or minor, but don't tell anyone. Just keep stum. Maybe send an anonymous gift. If you know someone's struggling, maybe send them an anonymous gift. That way they can't even thank you. The practice of secrecy. We make such a fuss about everything these days. Do things in secret, in quiet. Not for the praise, not for the thanks, but again, because it's the right thing to do. That make sense? You with me? And in all of these things, look to Jesus, who gave up power and control in self-giving love, emptying himself and taking the form of a servant or a slave. He humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. And God raised him up. And because of his death and his resurrection, God raises us up so that we may lift others up. Yes? Thanks be to God. Amen. Amen.